of repression. Most great opportunities in history are born of accident. In May of 1989, there were hundreds of journalists in Tiananmen Square. They came to cover Mikhail Gorbachev's visit in Beijing. The story they later wrote was entirely a different story. There were many journalists during the Tiananmen movement. We know that the Western media were present at that time. Additionally, many local Chinese journalists were there to cover the story. During the protest time, the Chinese media has experienced an unprecedented freedom of expression. Just imagine, these three gentlemen have been interviewed by the official CCTV right after they threw the axe on the Mao portrait. Reporters even dare to show their fellow countrymen the tragic aftermath of the Tiananmen crackdown on the television. Almost immediately, the government cut satellite transmission in an unsuccessful attempt to keep these harrowing events a secret from the rest of China. Although this period of freedom was relatively short-lived, it still, to this day, has an impact on the local Chinese media. Now, allow me to introduce you our distinguished panelist. Mr. Gordon Chan is an author and journalist, and he is several of his very well-known books, including The Coming Collapse of China, which I think have been read by you. And he has spent many years in Asia, in Hong Kong and China, and he's also author of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Far Eastern Economic Reviews, etc. Mr. Lucy Morillon headed the Washington office of Reporters Without Borders, and she used to specialize on the Eastern European countries and former Soviet Union. Mr. Jonathan Mirsky, based in London, is a famous author, scholar, and journalist. He used to teach in the university, but since the 70s he worked as correspondent in China, and he has witnessed the whole Tiananmen Square event. And just this morning he told me, and well, he doesn't want to be mentioned, but all his damage, physical damage, but exactly 20 years ago, exactly today or the day after. That's Mr. Mirsky. And his coverage about Tiananmen has been highly rewarded and awarded. Mr. Ethan Goodman is also a scholar, a researcher, and he spent a couple of years in China too, and he is an author for many books. And the most recent one is the Losing the New China, which has been published in 2004. Now, our first speaker, Mr. Gordon Chan, please.
The People's Republic of China respects the human rights of all of its citizens. The crackdown in Tiananmen was necessary to ensure 2 decades of orderly economic development. Only soldiers died in Tiananmen Square. That's what Beijing maintains. And now it aims to convince you that these assertions, plus other absurd notions, are true. The Communist Party's attack on truth is nothing if it is not unrelenting, thorough, and comprehensive. Of course, Beijing starts its assault on the truth at home. As we know, Deng Xiaoping ordered the slaughter in 1989 because he wanted to convince the Chinese people of the utter ruthlessness of the Communist Party and to demonstrate its power. But his successors have taken an opposite tack because they want to convince the Chinese people that the party acts in their best interests and governs with their consent. To support this new line in Beijing, the regime has tried to suppress the memory of Tiananmen. And as we know, the party, for the most part, has been able to prevent an open discussion of this incident inside the country. Textbooks don't mention it, teachers don't teach it, and for the most part, state media goes out of its way to ignore this event. Mainland chat rooms are scrubbed of references to the killings, and the Chinese search engines block articles on Tiananmen. Censors are quick to delete the numbers 6-4, the code that the Chinese have developed to refer to June 4th. The state works to make sure that traces of this incident have been scrubbed from society. Those who have lived through the events of June 4th, of course, remember. They remember the exhilaration of gathering in the square and the horror of the crackdown. But for China's young, Tiananmen has never happened. The party's erasure of history has been surprisingly successful. And let me give you an example from the time that my wife and I lived in China. In Shanghai in 1996, one day my wife and I were talking to Min, a woman who was then in her mid-20s. She had just learned from our conversation about the massacre, and she was taken aback. She learned about it because we were talking with her and her boyfriend, who was an American. But we were taken aback that someone could have lived during the turmoil of 1989 in a major city in China and not known that 1 million Chinese had gathered in the spiritual heart of their country, that the vicious 27th Army had fought its way through the streets of Beijing on the night of June 3, and that by the morning of June 4th, perhaps 3,000 people had been killed. There were at this time democracy protests and activities in 371 cities in China, including big rallies in Min's Shanghai. But this tactic of suppression sometimes can be too successful. In June 2007, for instance, a newspaper in Chengdu ran an ad commemorating the mothers of the Tiananmen massacre. A clerk had accepted the ad because she had never heard of the incident, but eventually 3 editors were fired. Paradoxically, this ignorance of Tiananmen may be more of a danger to the regime than full knowledge of it. Because they don't know all that occurred in 1989, young Chinese have developed this benign view of their government. Quote, "The only thing I can remember about June 4 is watching television and hearing that riot police had died," said Lu Jing, who was 6 at the time. Quote, "I don't believe any students died. China in this respect is democratic, as China wouldn't hurt its own people." These benign views of the younger Chinese mean that they are no longer afraid of their government. They now believe that they have rights and the space to exercise them. And as many have said, the Chinese take to the streets only when they think they can get away with it. So that's the dilemma for Beijing inside China. But outside China, the Communist Party, of course, knows that it cannot pretend that June 4th did not occur. So when Chinese officials talk about this event, they have to refer to euphemisms. For instance, delicately referring to the slaughter as, quote, "the event that happened in the late 1980s of last century," or more simply as, quote, "that 1989 affair." More important the Communist Party is trying to reinterpret the events of June 4th, giving it a new context which it has created. And to persuade us to accept their version of history, Beijing is pushing its largest media organizations to expand abroad with the goal of disseminating its messages, those about Tiananmen and others, to a global audience. To accomplish this, the official Xinhua news agency is doubling the number of its bureaus so that it will have offices in almost every country. China Central Television, CCTV, will add Russian and Arabic channels. And perhaps most ambitious of all, Xinhua is going to start a 24-hour worldwide news channel based on the model of Al Jazeera. The plan has already been put into action. First, China Daily, the official English language newspaper, launched a U.S. edition in February. Then People's Daily got into the act. People's Daily, which is the Communist Party's flagship publication and its self-described mouthpiece, has launched its Global Times newspaper this April. That joins the tabloid of the same name. The new Global Times, in an editorial which was issued on the day of its launch, stated that it would, quote, strive to reveal a complete and true picture of China, and it is, quote, dedicated to conveying the original voices of the Chinese people. Well, all of us know that no Communist Party publication can do any of that. What they're really trying to do is what Beijing said in January, and that is to, quote, better convey a good image of China to the world. The world does not need a good image of China. It needs an accurate image of China. And if we are to remember Tiananmen, and therefore understand the essential nature of the Chinese regime, we will have to counter the Communist Party's push to whitewash its image and change the global narrative of the one-party state. Well, what can we do? Well, of course, we can continue to try to counter the lies, the distortions, and the half-truths that regularly come from Beijing. There is now a global conflict between a China that is determined to kill the truth and the rest of us, who are just as determined to preserve it. We would, of course, like to think that the truth always prevails, but we do have to recognize that sometimes the truth can be overwhelmed. The Communist Party is now trying to overwhelm the truth with lots of cash. To make sure that Beijing's new global media push succeeds, the Ministry of Finance has allocated $6.6 billion in grants and subsidies. And none of us should be under any misapprehension, because we know that when Xinhua, CCTV, and People's Daily burn through this $6.6 billion in cash, there'll be another $6.6 billion, and another $6.6 billion after that. So what can we do? How do we fight this tide of money that will be used to tell our children that it was the soldiers who were the victims in Tiananmen and not the perpetrators, and that it was all right for Deng Xiaoping to slaughter hundreds and perhaps thousands so the Chinese people could learn a lesson about the use of state power? Well, here's a new idea. Let's jujitsu Beijing. Beijing has all of this money, so why don't we use Beijing's money against the Chinese central government? The central government will be subsidizing its publications to compete against our publications outside China. To me, that sounds like a trade issue. Why should we permit China to subsidize its publications against ours when the Chinese central government is pouring all of this money? That strikes me as unfair. Moreover, there is a more important trade issue. The Chinese central government blocks Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. And of course, it severely restricts CNN and other privately funded networks. Yet at the same time, CCTV, for instance, is allowed to distribute widely in the United States its English and Chinese language programming on cable. So should we allow any Chinese media into the United States? Television programming, books, magazines. The buzzword for me is reciprocity, and we should be demanding it. For far too long, however, the United States has not protected its own businesses from Chinese restrictions. In a series of agreements, especially the 1999 deal paving China's membership into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, Washington has accepted less access to the Chinese market than China has to the American one. Beijing's Go Global media initiatives raise more than trade issues, of course. The United States is an open society protected by the First Amendment, which is the core of our liberties. We believe in essentially a vigorous public debate that will preserve our free society. Yet now, an authoritarian state is seeking to influence that debate by spreading what it itself calls, quote, external propaganda. Should we permit China to do any of that? Whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, the Chinese government views the United States as an adversary, much the same way as the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. Although Beijing's tactics are more subtle than Soviet-era Moscow's, Chinese tactics, like the covert spreading of nuclear weapons technologies to dangerous and hostile states, are just as disruptive. So it is time for us to start to think about the national security implications of China's trade practices. And the first thing I think that we should do is to impose the same prohibitions on Chinese media in the American market that Beijing imposes on American media in China. We can do that within the framework of our WTO rules as well as our constitutional principles. After all, this is a trade issue, and the Constitution does not give the right to the Chinese government to disseminate propaganda in the United States. As our Supreme Court has said, quote, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. So let's use all of our tools to counter Chinese state media. And certainly, we have an obligation to do that, not just to ourselves, but also to future generations of Americans, and yes, the people of the great nation of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Jonathan Persky.
I'm sorry, John.
Well, I'm not the shyest person on the planet, but I can tell you I feel very shy here in the presence of Xu and Li over there. How does one survive 16 years in the can in China? Or these heroes down here? Or where is Harry Wu? Is Harry in the room? Amazing, isn't it astounding? I actually was going to say quite a lot of other things, but I think that I think we have to think about that. These people are survivors. 非常佩服你们三位，谢谢，谢谢，谢谢。Well, the great moment for me in Tiananmen was when I saw the employees of the People's Daily huge stable come in with a sign that said, "No more lies, don't teach us to lie." So I went over to the People's Daily that afternoon, and one of the editors there, it was this great period for Chinese journalism. He showed me a little card that he had that he was passing out to other journalists, and it said, rat droppings. He said, lies are like rat droppings in clear soup. They're obvious and they're disgusting. How true. How true. So there were all these Chinese journalists being brave, and it didn't take much. It isn't as if they had to sort of think a lot. They just suddenly appeared, as did numbers of soldiers and police. Now, I have to say that we clever journalists all thought this was the end of the party, that the government had disappeared. It was the happiest time in my many years in China that I've ever had. The only happy time was when I was in Beijing. People talked to each other. Instead of saying, "Have you eaten yet?" they'd say, "Have you demonstrated yet?" They talked to foreigners as if they were just ordinary people. It was very extraordinary. And all those stars in the eyes that a few foreigners had about China somehow reappeared in a kind of a realistic way. You know, this is really quite a nice country, full of well-meaning, friendly people, and the government is just going to let us all alone. There weren't any soldiers or police around. Little did we know that the Deng Xiaoping, whom the excellent Gordon has just told you about, and his frightful elders were thinking of exactly how to smash all this. That's what they were doing. The Chinese Party is very afraid of words, as such regimes are everywhere in the world. Words are killers for them. So they tend to kill people who do things that are like words, or acts that are really quite harmless. I mean, what's wrong with throwing some eggs at a portrait of Mao? I saw you all do that. And when they were all being grabbed by young people in white shirts and dark trousers, I thought, oh, that's the damn Chinese police who have come out of nowhere to arrest these people and drag them out of the square. Little did I know that these were students. Even then, when students were saying, Li Peng Xiaotai, get rid of, Li Peng should resign, Da Da Gong Chan Da, Da Da or Deng Xiaoping, smash these people, bring them down. You could not throw paint at Mao. It was too much for them. But there were people like this, and there were people like Xu Wenli and Harry, and we reporters didn't quite grasp it. What had happened was that, as Dai Qing used to say, or said once, if you have a very dark room and suddenly there's a little shaft of light, that shaft of light is very interesting, and suddenly a lot of people got really, really interested in what's happening in China. What is all of this? But the secrets remained, as Gordon has just said. It's the incident, it's the events, nothing really happened. When did that happen? Oh, it happened in the late 80s. So there were these secrets. Where is the tank man? Where is the man who stood in front of the tank? What's his name? When Jiang Zemin was asked about this, I think by Barbara Walters, he said, I don't think anything really bad happened to him. Well, where is he? What about the little Panchen Lama who was suddenly made to disappear? The answer to that is, he is where he's supposed to be. All of these secrets, Zhao Ziyang kept in prison in his house, under house arrest for 16 years, smuggling out his tapes. You should all read his book. This is a basic right. A basic human right is that all people should have an accurate memory of their own past. Chinese have been deprived of that. People like us can help them to remember. Here's a little thing that you could keep in mind. Not long after the Asian Games, not long after Tiananmen, Peking put on the Asian Games. And they had turned Beijing into a kind of Potemkin village. Everything looked great, shiny and white, flowers everywhere. Trains full of people coming into Beijing were stopped. So at a crossing, there was, this is one of these stories that sounds anecdotal, but it can't be true, but it is. At a crossing, there was an elderly woman who was sweeping up the donkey dung from the donkey carts that had been bringing supplies into the city in the morning. She was sweeping them up, and I said good morning, and I asked her if she'd eaten yet. And then I said, it's really beautiful what they've done to Beijing, isn't it? And she said, let me tell you something. And she pointed down at the donkey dung. Now, this happens to be a Chinese phrase. I hadn't heard it before. She said, see that? It's very bright and shiny, she said. But inside, it's just donkey shit. So that's what happened, and how terrible it was, and how good that we are here to bend our elbows into making sure that nobody forgets this. Sometimes even my Western friends say, aren't you a little tired of all of this? Shouldn't you move on? Jonathan, think about something else. Weigel. It's the same place. So it's good that you're here, and I encourage you to go out and do all the good things you can to make sure that we and the Chinese are not deprived of that important human right of an accurate picture of the past.